This is not for you.
Knowledge comes at a cost is the primary tagline of season 4 of From, and I think it's safe to say that it's cementing itself as one of the primary themes of the show. But it's also a theme that shows up in a lot of various mythologies, all the way from the biblical to the Lovecraftian. And I'm seeing a lot of fun little references to these mythologies across the newest season, so I wanted to take a few minutes to explore some of what might be relevant to what we've seen so far. Far and away the most prominent knowledge comes at a cost story, at least for the average American mind, is the biblical creation myth. The basic gist is that the Abrahamic God creates the first human, Adam, out of earth. After that, a second human, Eve, is created by taking a rib from the first. The two live in a peaceful paradise that English versions call the Garden of Eden, where they live without sin, without mortality, and without shame over their natural naked bodies. But the two of them are told to never eat the fruit of a specific tree in the garden. Its title is translated as the Tree of Knowledge of Good and Evil, and like with virtually every other detail across every other religion in human history, precisely what this detail means is contested. Maybe the fruit imparts knowledge of the existence of good versus evil. Maybe it's an example of merism, wherein good and evil is just a colloquialism for everything, and there's no element of moralism to it at all. Or maybe the knowledge is supposed to be something else entirely, like a metaphor for losing childhood innocence, or forming an internal sense of right and wrong, or perhaps even a very simple stand-in for the idea of power. Either way, the Eve character ends up eating the apple, and then the Adam character follows suit, and both are cast out of the garden to live and die as mortals. Most forms of Christianity that I'm aware of go so far as to say that this quote-unquote original sin in the garden actually taints every single descendant of the Adam and Eve characters, and that it takes a baptism to wash that original sin away. Unsurprisingly, given the general Christian terroir of virtually all mainstream American stories, references to the Adam and Eve story of course show up in From. Most obvious is the illustration in the opening credits of two figures that I imagine are intended to reflect Fatima and Ellis. This could be done specifically to compare them to the biblical Adam and Eve, given that the imagery of an unashamedly naked man standing beside an unashamedly naked woman in a nature setting is undeniably biblical symbolism within the American culture. Or maybe it's just foreshadowing that they're the two who are, gonna get naked and accidentally recreate this guy.
Hello, Kenny.
Then again, impossible conceptions and resurrections are also both heavily present in Christian mythology, so maybe it's still something to keep in mind. Every author dreams of having their work last. Maybe not all of us think we need a whole 2,000 years or more of title recognition, but it's always nice to have people appreciate our stories. How many of us, though, can honestly ever expect to not just codify an entire subgenre, let alone have one explicitly named for us? H.P. Lovecraft, for all he was a very unpleasant person in a whole host of different aspects, was a very weird guy who wrote very weird stuff. He's like an early 20th century Stephen King, prolifically writing horror fiction that wound up as one of the cornerstones of what we consider the genre to be nowadays. Lovecraft tropes and references show up everywhere, from King's works to the world-building in Game of Thrones to children's media like Scooby-Doo and Darkwing Duck. One of the most hugely prominent themes within Lovecraftian and cosmic horror is the idea that within the universe there exists incomprehensible knowledge the human mind simply cannot know. There are beings that, if you are unfortunate enough to look at them, will drive you insane as your brain tries to process what you're seeing. There are vast and alien creatures to which your individual existence is as important as any individual ant's life is to your own right now. There are cults operating in the shadows, books of forbidden magic, lonely and isolated survivors of horrific prehistoric species, and playbooks that you, should you ever find them, must never ever read. That last beat, of course, is a reference to Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, a collection of short stories which inspired Lovecraft's own horror works. Chambers himself was known in his lifetime as more of a romance writer, and some of the stories in the King in Yellow collection reflect this more than they reflect his modern legacy as the creator of the titular king. But the through line of the collection is decidedly in the horror genre, with various characters making reference to and/or encountering the play called The King in Yellow, a play that almost seems to compel those around it to read it, and condemns them if they do. The collection was interesting enough to Lovecraft that he very clearly incorporated it into his own understanding of weird fiction, up to the point of reappropriating some of the names in the story so as to heighten his own manifestations of the eerie cosmic themes. The King in Yellow was likely an influence on the creation of Lovecraft's Nyarlathotep and Stephen King's Crimson King, though King actually has a far more explicit King in Yellow reference character in the form of the masked, inhuman, low men in yellow coats from Hearts in Atlantis and the connecting Dark Tower mythology. And with the King in Yellow in mind, that brings us to the newest denizen of the town in From. A shape-shifting, murderous, and seemingly omniscient entity initially appearing in the guise of an old man in a yellow suit, the Man in Yellow, as the fandom is calling him, revels in violence, taunts, and trickery, and, according to Victor's memories and Julie's story-walking, goes so far as to eat the town's human residents after their deaths. Or eat parts of them, at least. Put a pin in that. Whether or not the Man in Yellow is an intentional reference to the King in Yellow, I'd say they have at least a little bit in common. They're both associated with forbidden knowledge and with being threats that show up unannounced and initially unrecognized, with the Man in Yellow arriving in town under the guise of Sophia the preacher's daughter, and the King in Yellow attending Camilla and Casilda's masquerade party as if he's just another human partygoer who will eventually be unmasked. Like with the Genesis story, of course, the King in Yellow, along with the color yellow itself, has become a casual staple of our fiction, regardless of any intentional parallelism or reference. Maybe the Man in Yellow has nothing to do with the King in Yellow, but let's be real here. The Man in Yellow is the big bad of a season that has "knowledge comes at a cost" as its tagline, and honestly, short of throwing in an actual Cthulhu, it doesn't really get much more cosmic horror than that. Creation myths, of course, are not limited to any one religion or mythology. If anything, I'd say they're the foundation of most story-based worldviews, because what bigger story is there to tell? What bigger question is there to answer, beyond where did we come from? For kids, that tends to be where did I come from? For adults, or anyone else who's lost their innocence, so to speak, it is instead where did humanity come from, and where did life itself come from? And every civilization makes up its own answers. Right now, in a world wherein we measure existence to the best of our abilities through the scientific method, we have concepts like the Big Bang, abiogenesis, and panspermia to try to explain different facets and possibilities involved in our origins. In the past, when all our ancestors had was observation, rudimentary experimenting, and heaps of imagination, humanity's concept of where it came from tended instead to have two key elements: some form of earth to create our bodies as a sculptor would make a statue, and the divine intervention of a god of some kind. And while most Americans are familiar with at least the barest bones of the Genesis story, I think a lot of us are also pretty familiar with the similar tale of Prometheus, whose myth involves not just the creation of mankind, but also yet another recounting of how humanity gained its first taste of forbidden knowledge. Prometheus, whose name is currently understood to translate into something like forethought, was a titan who, instead of joining his fellow titans in the war against the Olympians, instead created humanity on behalf of the new pantheon. Like Adam being created from dust and receiving the breath of life from the Abrahamic god, Prometheus's man, or men, it's kind of unclear, were made from mud, and Zeus's daughter Athena, the goddess of wisdom, was the one to breathe life into them. And the parallels go on. In Genesis, humanity gains forbidden knowledge essentially by being seduced or tricked into taking it despite orders otherwise. In the Prometheus story, as recounted by Hesiod, Prometheus is fonder of humanity than he is of the new king of the gods. He attempts to trick Zeus under the guise of an offering, and Zeus, described as angry at heart, as wrath came to his spirit, punished humanity by refusing to allow them the power of unwearying fire. Prometheus, though, stole said fire to give to humanity anyway, and so Zeus went on to punish humanity and Prometheus both. Mankind he actually punished by creating women, who Hesiod describes with language virtually identical to everything that comes out of the modern manosphere. And Prometheus he punished with chains and unending torment, literally being chained to a rock and set upon by an eagle that would eat his liver every day, then return the next day, at which point the liver would have regrown overnight to eat it once again, and on, potentially forever. And in case you haven't clocked it, the basic elements of the story are actually pretty similar. There's a wrathful deity who won't let humanity have some form of knowledge. There's mankind being made of mud and the breath of a god. There's womankind being made later to be directly responsible for the suffering of all subsequent generations of men. And there's a trickster who helps humanity get the knowledge that the gods are keeping from us. It's just that in the Greek myth, the wrathful god only ordered the creation of humanity, while the trickster was the one who literally carried it out. The apple element, that's missing, of course, but, well, actually, no. There are apples in the Prometheus story. Though, of course, we can always quibble on what exactly apple means in a biblical or classical mythology sense of fruit definitions. Anyway, remember this guy? So, in Greek, he's actually called Hercules, not Hercules, and his story is very different from the Disney film, but I'm sure you know the basic concept of that he was a super strong son of Zeus, and he fought at least a couple monsters. Among these monsters, at least in Apollodorus, was the very eagle that was chowing down on Prometheus every single day. Basically, Heracles had been tasked with finding the golden apples of the Garden of the Hesperides for this king who wanted to eat them to become immortal. The apples were guarded by this snaky dragon guy called Ladon. So while he was heading to the garden, he came across Prometheus and the monster eagle, killed the eagle to free Prometheus, and Prometheus was grateful enough to give him some good advice on how to actually get his hands on the apples without risking his own life, which was by tricking the Titan Atlas into killing the snake and getting the apples for Heracles. So there it is. We've got a serpent in a garden with a forbidden apple tree once again. That probably doesn't mean anything for Fromm specifically, but it definitely does demonstrate one thing very clearly. Stories are only ever really building upon other stories. We've all got the same grab bag of tropes, motifs, archetypes, and themes to choose from. We just filter them all a bit differently through our own personality, culture, and lived experiences. What I will say in terms of Fromm specifically, though, is that two things stuck out to me in the most recent episode. Though Victor describes the man in yellow as eating people, when Julie Story walks back to see this massacre turned banquet, the only thing we actually witness him eating is the liver of one of the townsfolk that will be replaced at a later part in the cycle, just like Prometheus's own liver grew back every night, only to be eaten once again by his monster. But his monster was a bird monster, and obviously the man in yellow isn't associated with birds in any way, shape, or form, except for that one thing that happened in that same episode with the bird. You know, the thing where the man in yellow, as Sophia, threw himself into the empty pool to break his own arm, and then Ethan discovered a little bird with its own arm, wing, obviously, similarly broken. And interestingly, at the end of the episode, Ethan essentially baptizes that little bird in what he believes to be the Lake of Tears. Does that mean anything? Probably not. This is probably the literary analysis equivalent of casting bones to predict the future, but, well, I'm fond of all the little connections you can find between works of fiction. I like looking for them, even when maybe they're not actually there. I mean, maybe the show is intentionally referencing Prometheus, or maybe it's not. There's not really any way to know for sure at this point, unless you're on the writing staff. But with that said, there's a reference I am much more sure of. Not completely sure, maybe, but sure enough that I'll be genuinely a bit disappointed if it somehow isn't intentional. For all classical mythology is very well taught in the American school system, or at least it was in the 2000s, Norse mythology is much less prominent. I think by this point in pop culture, almost everyone knows the names Odin, Loki, and Thor, plus maybe Midgard, Mjolnir, and Yggdrasil, but most people don't know much about these mythic figures beyond what's made it into Marvel, so you might not know that there's also a major element of knowledge-seeking within the story of Odin himself. Comparable in many ways to Zeus, Odin is a kind of wise old man figure who was the leader of his pantheon. He was also one of the three brother deities who created the first man and woman in Norse mythology. Unlike Zeus, though, whose major traits included promiscuity, wrath, and pride, Odin is more of a doomed figure, a wanderer whose primary driver largely seemed to be gathering the wisdom and resources necessary to avert his fated demise during Ragnarok. Wisdom really is Odin's big thing. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Anthony Hopkins portrays Odin while wearing an eye patch, but in the source mythology, Odin's eye was not lost in battle, as is implied in the Thor films. In the mythology, Odin plucked it out himself, as payment for the knowledge that he sought. Basically, in Norse mythology, the cosmos is represented by this tree called Yggdrasil. Along the roots and trunk and branches of this tree are the 9 realms, as mentioned in Marvel, with 3 wells or springs beneath the roots of the tree and a collection of animals throughout. Of note, these animals include an eagle perched in the upper branches of the tree, as well as various dragons and/or serpents gnawing at the tree's roots. And apparently the eagle and the serpents have some kind of beef that involves a squirrel carrying insults back and forth between them, because mythology can be very silly sometimes. Anyway, during Odin's quest for knowledge, he went to go visit this guy named Mimir, who himself gained, quote, great knowledge when he drank from one of the springs beneath Yggdrasil. So, wanting that same knowledge, Odin went down to the wellspring and asked for a sip. And Mimir was like, sure thing, you can have a drink, as soon as you offer up a sacrifice. So Odin ripped out his eye, plucked it into the wellspring, and was at last allowed to drink.
She's in the root cellar.
But of course, that's not the only sacrifice that Odin made during his quest for knowledge. It's not even really his most well-known. If you're at all familiar with tarot, which you should be since we've already seen an attempt at a reading happen back in Season 3, you might also be familiar with some of the motifs upon the cards. One of them within the major arcana is the Hanged Man. Now, the Hanged Man card likely originated from a form of Renaissance art depicting capital punishment. This form of portraiture, essentially called defaming portraits in English, typically depicted not actual capital punishment carried out, but traitors and thieves being humiliated by being hanged from one ankle in the presence of unclean animals like livestock. However, in the Pittura Infamante that appears within the tarot specifically, the Hanged Man is often depicted not as suffering, but as serene, which hints that maybe he wants to be there. And so one has to ask the question, who would want to be hanged like that? To which, of course, Norse mythology already had a ready-made answer in the form of another self-sacrificial Odin tale. In this particular story, Odin again wished to gain someone else's demonstrated knowledge for himself. This time he sought to learn what the Norns knew. The Norns essentially being the Norse equivalent of the Grecian fates. Unlike the Moirae, though, who pretty much had thread work as their whole thing, the Norns are associated with a few different kinds of divination, particularly runes. So, with the Norns able to use the runes to uncover the mysteries of fate, Odin wanted that same knowledge for himself. But as Fromm tells us,
knowledge comes with a cost.
And so Odin had to make another sacrifice, this one much bigger than a simple eye. In a move that has created a strong pop culture association between Odin and the Hanged Man, quote, Odin hung himself from a branch of Yggdrasil, pierced himself with his spear, and peered downward into the well of Erd. Hanged like that, potentially but not necessarily upside down, Odin survived in the liminal space between being alive and being dead for 9 days and 9 nights until at last he understood the runes and could get down off the tree. But what does this have to do with Fromm? Well, just take another look at Jim's death.
Why? Why did I do that to him?
It's a good question. Why would his body be in that particular pose? If it's nothing, that's a wild storytelling choice. More likely, it's got something to do with the Hanged Man, either because it's trying to point us toward the tarot, or because it's trying to point us toward Odin and his quest for forbidden knowledge. Of course, the rules of the Fromm universe mean that Jim's not going to be getting down from his hanging. The dead in this story are gone, and they don't have any further interaction with the...
Dad?
Oh. Okay, well, it would still break the story for someone to come back to life. I mean, they'd have to set up that kind of thing right from the earliest moments of the show if they wanted to...
Norman's dead. When you're dead, you're gone.
Bring him back. You have to bring him back.
Norman, they made it back from the Lake of Tears. It wasn't too late.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, who knows? Maybe Ethan's Lake of Tears might have something to do with the Well of Erd. Maybe Jim is doing whatever his version of staring down into the wellspring is, and something, story walking, something, he comes back. That's where the comparison would have to end, since it's not like there are any runes that he could... Ah, fuck. Still, it's not like we don't already know where the talismans came from. Boyd found them, and it's not like he's had anybody off-screen mystically giving him something in a moment of crisis before.
Who is that?
Hey, what?
Alright, fine. We've got a hanged man, we've got a mystical water source, we've got runes, and we've got a guy who appears to be potentially stuck in the liminal space between dead and alive. It's beginning to look a lot like Odin. But maybe that's just me seeing connections where there aren't any real connections to be seen. I do that. Regardless of whether any of this is really in the show or not, I've got to be honest, I'm having a ball so far. Fromm has done some very weird, silly, and aggravating things at times, while also making plenty of fun, cool, and creative choices too. I think there's a lot of great things about this show, from its premise and atmosphere to its characters and themes, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how the penultimate and final seasons play out. And if somehow Jim's death is in some way related to the creation of the talismans in some timey-wimey fashion, I'm gonna absolutely lose my mind.